In this session, we're going to be focusing more on the actual mission work in the Restoration Movement, the Stone Campbell movement, and thinking about the different areas that missionaries were sent, a little bit about some missionaries, not too many specifically by name, some of the challenges that Restoration Movement missionaries faced, and just kind of a very broad scale. We'll look predominantly at region, mention a couple specific countries, but just kind of trying to do a flyover of the different efforts. In so doing, we're just going to predominantly focus on works by the Churches of Christ and the disciples. The independent Christian churches were active as well, and I don't want to say that they should be ignored, but again, just trying to do a broad overview. As we mentioned in the previous session, of course, mission at work has been a very important part of the Restoration Movement, and is reflective in a lot of activity by people within the Restoration Movement and its heritage in the Churches of Christ, especially today, and the independent Christian churches today. A little bit different for the disciples, as we mentioned, much more of an ecumenical focus, and certainly the disciples being involved more in social activity alongside that mission work, or predominantly focusing their mission work on social activity and not as much on evangelism as might be the case with the Churches of Christ in the independent Christian churches. In many respects, since this is a movement that starts in the 19th century, it's starting just as there is that renewed interest in missionary work from a Protestant standpoint that is really starting to take off. And the Restoration Movement is, in some sense, late to the game compared to some other religious groups. And it's not until you start seeing in the 50s, 1850s, the Restoration Movement starting to be involved specifically in overseas missions. To some extent, some of those early places were places where there were already members of denominations, where there were denominations active, and so some of that was an attempt to try and draw people away from those denominations. But eventually there is an effort to start foreign missions in lands where that are predominantly non-Christian. So we'll look at a variety of regions here and cover some efforts by the Restoration Movement missionaries. Let's start with Africa. Remember that Africa is really a bigger mission field in the 20th century than the 19th century, although some preliminary efforts are made in the 19th century in Africa. It's not, though, until the 20th century when there is such an explosion of conversions and churches and mission efforts that really impacts Africa. Let's look, though, at the disciples' work. First, we already noted that one of the first missionaries to Africa from the Restoration Movement was a freed slave named Alexander Cross, who goes to Liberia in 1854. Cross was born sometime around 1811, is the best estimate of historians. He was a slave when the vice president of the American Christian Missionary Society happened to hear him speak on temperance. Did some preaching as well, and so he hears him preaching about temperance. Temperance, of course, related to not drinking alcohol, a very important social issue in the 19th century. And so this vice president, David Burnett, hears Cross speak and is convinced that he needs to be very active, and that what would really be useful is for him to be a missionary to Liberia. Now, Liberia as a country is still relatively new at this time, and it had been created partly through work through the United States with the intention of a lot of people who supported the idea of colonization of freed slaves. So the northern opponents of slavery, a lot of them were colonizers, colonizationists, and so they thought that what should happen is the slaves should be freed and sent back to Africa, even though by this point in history a lot of these people that are enslaved didn't grow up in Africa. They weren't born in Africa, but the notion was we'll send the slaves back to Africa. And so Liberia was created as a country that colonized slaves could be sent to. And so the idea was let's free Cross, and we'll send him back to Liberia. We'll send him to Liberia. And so Burnett encourages a variety of churches to purchase his freedom, which they do, and he is sent to Liberia as a missionary. As I mentioned in previous session, though, the efforts in Liberia end pretty quickly. Cross dies just a few months after getting to Liberia. I think it's only like 2 months. And so he dies in 1854, and that essentially ends the mission work to Africa for quite some time. It'll be later that it'll be picked up, and actually, it's like 40 years later, in the later part of the 19th century. There would be other efforts in the later 19th century, first to Congo in 1885 and to Nigeria in 1895. The Congo mission ended because of the finances required. Many of these other missions ended fairly quickly. The first fairly successful work began in Congo 12 years after that first mission. So the first mission starts, it ends pretty quickly. Toward the end of the 19th century, the disciples try again. It is a more successful work, a longer lasting work, predominantly because there is greater cooperation with African Christians and the missionaries that are coming. There were some challenges that the disciples had coming into mission work in Congo. Presbyterian and Baptist missionaries there have been protesting some human rights abuses by the government. And the state and the government was reluctant to let new missionaries in. So even though the disciples weren't affiliated with the Presbyterians or Baptists, there was still this opposition to new missionaries because of the protesting that was going on. Congo remained a focus of the disciples even into the 20th century. They would be involved in other countries as well, but there was a lot of effort in Congo. Missionaries worked on creating teaching materials, preaching, but also then opening schools and hospitals. A lot of the converts and the nationals in Congo became involved fairly early on in evangelizing. Essentially, the missionaries kind of let the Congolese Christians do much of the evangelism work. They were helping, but they were kind of letting them do a lot of the work. When Congo gained its independence from colonial powers, the church leaders began to assert more authority, and the missionaries were kind of considered their partners, right? So they're the ones that are really doing the effort, and you can help us instead of you being kind of in charge and we'll help you. So there's a shift as well in power between the church leaders and the missionaries that take place after this. Disciples also get involved in the creation of the Protestant University of Congo, suggesting this more ecumenical focus of the disciples on the mission field. in the idea of them helping out this other university. When it comes to the Churches of Christ, one of the first missionaries to Africa came from New Zealand. His name was John Sheriff. So it is not Americans or British, or specifically from Britain, but from New Zealand. Sheriff went to South Africa, eventually working in the country of Rhodesia. Rhodesia is now Zimbabwe. And he essentially goes there and is a tent maker. Well, he's a stonemason. I mean, tent maker in the sense of he works to support himself, like Paul does. So Sheriff uses his stone cutting abilities to support himself while also evangelizing. Eventually, he would make some appeals and would get missionaries from the United States and elsewhere to come and help in the mission work. The work in Africa essentially went through 3 phases throughout the 19th and 20th century. The first stage, or the first phase, was the mission station phase, things that we've seen already, like with Carey, with the Judsons, with other missionaries we've looked at. You create this mission station that is kind of an encampment, and then from there you go out and go to other places. And so a lot of the focus is on the mission. That's where the home base is. Sheriff represents that first stage. He began a mission station in Cape Town, South Africa. He would later go on to create one in Rhodesia. Essentially, a lot of the mission was on evangelism, right? So planting churches. There's some school work, creating schools, education, most of them night classes. But then also creating a system to train national evangelists. Right? So kind of a preacher training school for people of the country. He would later encourage a variety of other missionaries to establish mission stations in Zambia, Malawi, as well as others in Zimbabwe. The second phase, the institution building phase, was focused more on institutions like schools, hospitals. I mean, Sheriff had done some things with schools, but these are even grander institutions of what he established. This brought missionaries into Nigeria, Tanzania, Botswana, in an expansion of creating schools that were more colleges, higher education, along with hospitals. One of the converts from South Africa in this phase was a man named Abraham Malherbe. Malherbe is well, he passed away a couple years ago. He was a famous New Testament scholar who taught at Yale Divinity School. Member of the Churches of Christ. So Malherbe is converted in the second wave of mission work. He will eventually make it to the United States, and he gets education, becomes a scholar in the New Testament, well known even outside of the Churches of Christ. Focusing a lot on the social world, the social situation of early Christianity. And as I mentioned, just passed away. It's probably 5 or 6 years ago now, but is part of this effort. In this second phase, the work would continue to expand into Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia. The third wave, the contextualizing missions wave, started in the 1970s, and just like other mission efforts that were focusing on contextualized missions, there's more of this trying to establish ethnic churches, that are as fully indigenous as possible. The goal is not to convert people to Christianity and Western culture. It's having a lot of customs related to the indigenous people, dress, etc. And so less about making them Western in addition to Christians. And so there was a lot more focus on that. And a lot of that has to do with a general trend, a general shift that's taking place in missiology, largely in Christianity, but then also kind of Churches of Christ adopting that as well. These teams would expand and work in places like Kenya, Uganda, Benin, Botswana as well, among other places. Another major area of effort for Restoration Movement missionaries was Asia. Both the Foreign Christian Missionary Society and the Christian Women's Board of Missions were involved in mission work in Asia. They both kind of come to the same conclusion around the same time. Both of them in 1881 start making plans and then say, oh, wait, why don't we work together for this? And so the first mission team sent out consisted of 1 man and 4 single women, selected by these two societies. They started in India, and then they would bring in other missionaries from other areas as well. And so they expanded to other mission fields soon after. A team went to Japan in 1883, another went to China in 1886. Soon after that, Tibet, the Philippines were also included as well. Often, or not often, sometimes, the early efforts here in Asia were done independently from the American Christian Missionary Society. Some of these missionaries felt that it would be easier to get larger support from churches if they didn't go through the Missionary Society. Remember, we're talking late 1800s, so there's still some connections between the Churches of Christ and Disciples. Those are a lot weaker. But any missionary coming to the Churches of Christ from the Missionary Society is going to get rejected. And so some missionaries wanted some independence, and so or went independent to maybe gain funds from a variety of congregations. The open membership controversy, of course, becomes really a focus because of things done in Asia. We mentioned China, of course. The Philippines was another area where there was a significant concern about open membership, which, so missionary work here kind of leads to a split between conservative and liberal disciples. The conservative wing, which would eventually become the independent Christian churches, right? While they're still apart with the disciples, they started directly supporting missionaries rather than going through the United Christian Missionary Society at this point. So, that becomes a issue because there's this open membership issue, and who's going to support missions. So there's a lot of questions of missions at this time that are tied up with the questions of identity and who they were as a movement, and what they were standing for and who they were going to be. All of that is kind of coming to a head in this mission work. The Churches of Christ as well were active in missionary work in Asia. They would send missionaries to Japan and to China, Korea. There would be, in some cases with the Churches of Christ, there would be several nationals who had gone to schools, to universities in the United States, been converted, and then went back to their homelands and started works and churches. Korea, that appears to be the major way Churches of Christ entered Korea, was through an individual who had gone to the United States and then was converted and then went back. Like other groups, of course, the Churches of Christ faced financial challenges when it came to missions because of the Great Depression, World War II, which brought struggles for missionaries as well as funding. Mission work in Japan and some parts of China was suspended, and some missionaries, like Sarah Andrews, of the churches of Christ stayed in the field. And so this happened for the disciples as well. There's this kind of some missionaries staying, other missionaries leaving. Sarah Andrews was born in 1893 in Tennessee. She went to Japan in 1916 and stayed there until her death in 1961. So for the majority of her life lives on the mission field in Japan. She helped establish at least 8 Japanese congregations. There's possibility there might have been more. Despite that success, she did face a lot of challenges, especially during World War II. She was put under house arrest. She was imprisoned. So she was imprisoned, and then she was also under house arrest at other times. She fell ill several times. She experienced malnourishment at some times because of lack of resources. But after the war, well, even during the war, she continued to care for the poor, the sick, the wounded, to try and help out and show the love of Christ. And after the war, she operated or opened a home for widows, Japanese widows, some of soldiers and some of people that died in other situations. She also encouraged young Japanese men to go to the United States for education. Was well beloved in the area. When she died, her grave marker was erected both by Christians and non-Christians. So she had a profound effect on a variety of people. But that does reflect the challenges that a lot of missionaries have had, both within the Restoration movement and outside, especially in the post-World War II period. And missionaries were imprisoned in Thailand and China. The Japanese army closed a variety of churches in Korea when it occupied Korea. Now, work still continued in India during the time. It continued in some parts of China during the time, but there was a lot of difficulties that people faced. When the war ended, missionaries either returned or renewed their efforts. Mission stations that had been used were reopened. Churches that had been closed down were reopened. And then missionaries started working in other places, expanded into other countries as well. However, when communism began to spread in the 1940s, 1950s, missionaries again faced renewed challenges. When the communists took over in China, for example, a lot of missionaries were either expelled from the country or were imprisoned. Many of the missionaries who left China went to surrounding countries. And so, it was a matter of, okay, we got to leave here, but we're going to still be active. Something similar happened when North Korea Korea split into two, and North Korea became communist. Ministers were arrested, churches were destroyed, and so missionaries faced a lot of challenges. In the latter part of the 20th century, there's been an increase in missionaries from the Churches of Christ, as well as from the independent Christian churches coming to Asia, interested in work in Asia. The disciples, on the other hand, often merged their work with a variety of national united churches in various Asian countries. And so instead of trying to do mission work that was distinctly disciples in nature, it was much more ecumenically focused, as we've talked about before. In Asia, there has been sizable growth, predominantly for the independent Christian churches and the Churches of Christ, because it is much more evangelistic. And a lot of that growth has been in places like India, the Philippines, Myanmar, what used to be Burma. These are the places where there have been the greatest success in recent years for Asia. There's also been efforts in Europe to evangelize. And in some respects, we can kind of split this efforts between pre-World War II and post-World War II. The earliest work, as I mentioned before, was done in England, France, Denmark, Scandinavia, all places with national churches, with sizable populations that would identify as Christian of some sort. Much of this early work that was done was predominantly disciples-oriented, supported by the Foreign Christian Missionary Society. Ultimately, a lot of the work done, especially by the disciples, by both the disciples and the Churches of Christ, pre-World War II, not a lot of success. There's not a lot of people that give up their denominational affiliation and become part of the Restoration movement. There's some success in Britain, but not much elsewhere. In the late 19th century, so this early effort, largely disciples-oriented. Later 19th century, students in the Nashville Bible School, more connected with the Churches of Christ, as well as a couple of sister institutions, began work in Europe for the Churches of Christ. A lot of the focus these early years for Churches of Christ was in Germany, but again, not a lot of success. When the situation in Europe starts to deteriorate and war begins to be closer, there is a decline of people from the United States who are working in Europe as missionaries. The number of people are leaving, new people aren't coming because of just there's tension and struggle, and of course, there's a question of will there be war and all those kind of things. But a lot of people kind of think that now's not the time to be in Europe, predominantly Western Europe. When it comes to other places in Europe, for example, the disciples were connected with some Russian Christians in the early 1900s. These were Russian Christians who were kind of restorationist. They had some similar ideas. They were looking for bringing about reform in Russian Christianity. They tended to call themselves like gospel Christians or Bible Christians. And so they kind of came to these conclusions on their own. The movement was started by a man named General Pashkov. Americans would later nickname him the Alexander Campbell of Russia. He had a lot of similar ideas, and so he had started this movement. And so the disciples, as they encountered this, they kind of start working together. But there's not a lot of opportunity to evangelize while Russia was under the czars prior to the Russian Revolution. Because of the way that the czars often view Russian Orthodoxy and some other things related to state religion. When the Russian Revolution happened in 1917 and World War I ended, there were some opportunities for relief efforts, but there were also other challenges because of the atheistic nature of the Russian government. There was some success in Poland due to a Polish student who studied in the United States and then came home. He served as a missionary for the American Christian Missionary Society for a time, but then also kept up the work even after he had kind of fulfilled his obligation. After World War II, however, things began to change because there's an increased opportunity for mission work. And as we mentioned before, the disciples kind of take the same approach. They tend to work with these ecumenical bodies or organizations, or they work with institutions that are already established, whether they were established by disciples or not. The first efforts of the disciples post-World War II were in France, working with a lot of what are known as the historical churches or the state churches to help refugees. So some of the denominations already present. The independent Christian churches and the Churches of Christ tended to be more focused on evangelizing from the standpoint of the distinctiveness of the Restoration movement. And so they're not as focused on relief effort. They're not as focused on working with other denominations. They're interested in evangelizing, but they were also benevolent as well, but not in an ecumenical type of way like the disciples were. Germany, especially West Germany, Germany used to be two countries. West Germany was an important target for evangelism after the war. And it was, a good place for American missionaries to go. There were a lot of American troops that were present there in Germany in a variety of bases, and a lot of the efforts started on American bases. But there was also a lot of humanitarian need in Germany at the time as well, efforts to help alleviate some of the suffering in the post-war period. So it's kind of, to kind of connect this again, it's because of the missionary efforts in Germany, or the potential for missionary efforts in Germany, that G.C. Brewer proposed the sponsoring church plan, or the Broadway plan. Is German missions was kind of the predominant focus. The Crescent Hills Church of Christ in Brownsville, Texas, picks some of this up and serves as a sponsoring church for mission work in Italy. But Germany and Italy, of course, they were on the wrong side of World War II, the losing side, and so the Italian people, the German people, needed a lot of help. In fact, the Churches of Christ were the first American religious group to receive a permit from the West German government to send missionaries to Germany after the war. So they kind of get the opportunity to go in first. Missionaries planted churches, they created a boys' home, a Bible college, all of which were created shortly after the war. And again, a lot of these started on American military bases and then spread out to the German population. The independents tried something similar in Germany, but they didn't have as much success as the Churches of Christ. They had more success in Italy, actually. Other places in Europe, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, were largely closed as mission fields while the communists were in power. There were some efforts to send radio broadcasts into Eastern Europe. I talked about Eastern European missions, smuggling Bibles. You had those kind of things. Subversive, silent, these kind of beginning attempts. But the communist control was pretty significant, and so there wasn't any sort of sizable scale that anybody could do much until the later 20th century, when these communist governments start to fall. And as they lose power, this opens up a variety of countries now. So as the Berlin Wall falls, and as the Soviet Union starts to deteriorate, then Poland and Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and a variety of other communist countries start, they have their own kind of revolts of people against the communist leaders. And so that really opened up the opportunity for missionaries from a variety of groups, but especially from the Restoration Movement, to go into these countries. Because now evangelism was possible, church planting, and even humanitarian aid. There were groups like TCM International, which had started in Toronto, as well as Eastern European Missions, which provided people with Bibles, with Christian literature. TCM International was also working to provide food and clothing, medicine, right? So there's evangelistic efforts, there's church planting, there's humanitarian need. Others were working to try and reconnect with Christians who had been affiliated with one branch or the other of the Restoration Movement prior to the rise of communism, and so trying to reestablish some of those links. In addition, a variety of schools of biblical studies were created to try and educate people, especially ministers, who could lead in churches, who could also do mission work in other places of a particular country or go to other countries. The last area I want to talk about is Latin America and the Caribbean. The disciples sent the first missionary to Mexico in 1895. Others would go on to join him. They would set up a school, a print shop, a reading room, all in addition, of course, to holding worship services, visiting, those kind of things. The Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century, however, changed a lot of mission work because it prohibited Mexican and foreign churches from owning property. So any churches were banned from holding property, whether they were from Mexico or whether they were from some other country. This led to a lot of governmental corruption as officials were open to receiving bribes and other types of things. Eventually, this position was overturned after Pope John Paul II visited Mexico in 1979. Some of this was a backlash to colonialism. Some of it was, just a general response. And it wasn't something that necessarily the disciples alone faced. Other religious groups faced as well, considering, of course, it changes when Pope John Paul shows up. A lot of the early work by disciples was in northern Mexico, just over the border, but eventually shifted to central Mexico. Part of the reason for the shift was an agreement to work with other denominations about doing mission work in Mexico. And so it was kind of like, we'll take this part, you take this part. And so the disciples are actually assigned central Mexico, which of course is a concern to some of those theological conservatives about these further relationships with other denominations. We mentioned that mission work in Jamaica had started. It was in 1858. It stopped because of the Civil War. Funding dried up, but it was restarted in 1876. When Jamaica became an independent country, when it got its independence from Great Britain, the church too became autonomous, kind of separated itself from the missionaries. After the Spanish-American War in this period, work was started in Puerto Rico. A girls' orphanage was started in 1900. The first church was started in 1901. This church would later have some problems with the United Christian Missionary Society, the Disciples Overseas Ministries, but eventually those were reconciled, right? So there's some conflict here between people in Puerto Rico as well as, the boards and societies in the United States. In fact, by the latter part of the 20th century, disciples missionaries from Puerto Rico were going to other Latin American countries. So there has been some success in training and educating ministers and missionaries from within the population of Puerto Rico. Work in Cuba was started in 1899, but the Cuban Revolution in the 1940s, obviously that ended a lot of the work in Cuba as far as missionary work, and churches were kind of left on their own. In more recent years, because of some of the falls with relationships, there have been some abilities for people to travel to Cuba. Other works by the disciples were started in South America, places like Argentina, British Guiana, toward the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries. The Great Depression, 2 world wars also slowed down missionary efforts, even in Latin America. That even though there's not a lot of fighting there, right? That this is kind of one of the places in the world where there's not that much involvement on the soil. It still has an impact on funding and being able to support missionaries. In the post-World War II period, there were a lot of people who go to Latin American countries or to the Caribbean countries who, it seemed like a lot of people who were interested in missions in Latin America. Now, a lot of the people in Latin America were Catholic, but with the independence in the 19th century, those alliances between these countries and the Catholic Church, of course, as we talked about in another session, began to be strained, so there was more opportunity for other groups to get in there. Disciples, as we've mentioned before, I know it's same thing over and over again, did a lot of mission work in cooperation, and one group that they worked in cooperation with was Pentecostals. And so this was kind of a little bit of a strange pairing between the disciples and Pentecostals. But Pentecostalism has had some pretty significant success in Latin America. And so a lot of the Latin American Christians who are not Catholic but are Protestant, a lot of them tend to be Pentecostal. A lot of the ecumenical focus was especially true in the 60s and 70s, as a variety of human rights abuses happened, as a variety of dictators took over some of these countries. And so the disciples would get involved with these other groups to protest abuses, human rights abuses, to try and protect religious leaders and other people because of some of the efforts that were being made by a variety of these governments. In the later part of the 20th century, the disciples started focusing more on Central America, Nicaragua in 1986, for example. In more recent years, though, the number of missionaries active in the region has declined. Some of that is due to some of the things that the disciples have decided to do. Others of that has been due to a decline in funding. When it comes to the Churches of Christ, there were also numerous efforts in Latin America, but a lot of these efforts were later than the disciples. The disciples kind of started before, as has been the case. Some of the early efforts to Latin Americans were to Spanish-speaking populations in the United States, but then also gradually moving into Mexico and other places as well. The earliest work appears to have been in Texas to Hispanic and Spanish-speaking populations, and then gradually working over the border into northern Mexico. Of course, there had been Spanish Bibles in existence for a while, so there's not necessarily a need to retranslate the Bible, but one important aspect of Churches of Christ mission work, as far as translation goes, was to translate hymns into Spanish. And so that was an important early activity. And the hymn book that was created is actually still pretty popular in a lot of Spanish-speaking congregations. The first lasting work, sizable work, in South America was in Uruguay in 1952. So again, post-World War II period, where the disciples had been in Latin America before World War II. The first convert in Argentina was in 1957. So you see it's kind of starting to spread to other countries. But the work really wasn't well supported by churches in the United States. There's a lot of interest in other places. South America is not as, in those early post-war period, isn't as much of a place of attention for missionary funding. There were other converts and two small churches that were established in Buenos Aires, but there's not a consistent missionary presence. There are several missionaries, and they just kind of get cycled out. There's a lot of names, but then they're kind of gone, and somebody else is coming in. When you look at the history, mission work started in Chile in the 1950s. something odd in the mission work in Chile. So there's some early success, the establishment of a couple congregations, and then some of the missionaries go to the United States on a furlough, and they return to find that most of the members of the churches that they left had become Pentecostal. Right? So in that short amount of time, and in fact, one of the other missionaries, one of the ones that stayed, is responsible for leading them into Pentecostalism. So just an odd change. Everything seems to be on. We leave, we come back. Right? A change had taken place. World Bible School was effective here. World Bible School had kind of started with a focus on Africa, but was used in South America as well. Getting to places where missionaries were not in existence, or where missionaries were not, or getting into places where it would be difficult for missionaries to get to. And often, because of the number of missionaries, sometimes missionaries from one country ended up traveling to other countries to baptize students. So, there's efforts here, but the number of people on the ground to support it was sometimes a challenge. Another institution that was useful in evangelizing in South America was World Radio. World Radio broadcast missionary messages to Bolivia to try to evangelize. It was started by the Whites Ferry Road Church of Christ in West Monroe, Louisiana. That is the church home of several of the people in the Duck Dynasty clan, if you know that show. They created a radio program in the 50s to broadcast messages using radio to evangelize. Herald of Truth was also used, if you remember Herald of Truth from our discussions about institutionalism. Christian missionaries from the Churches of Christ moved into Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela throughout the 50s and 60s. They faced challenges like all missionaries do, but some challenges were different in South America. For example, due to the violence from drug dealers in the 1980s, all the missionaries from Churches of Christ left Colombia, which essentially kind of left the national evangelists to kind of continue the work. A family of missionaries was threatened. The country of Colombia was just a very, very violent place with all sorts of drug cartels and everything going on in the 1980s, and still some of that today, but not as bad as it was in the 80s. There's also been a lot of work done in Central America. Guatemala appears to be the first country targeted in 1959. 5 churches were established in the first year of work in Guatemala. The missionaries there used correspondence courses, evangelistic campaigns to try and reach people. The establishment of local national preachers, though, was a big help to the work, and those preachers would go on to convert thousands and establish 25 additional congregations. El Salvador and Honduras followed soon after. Here too, the use of correspondence courses, the use of campaigns was successful. Similar type of situation as what we've seen in other places, where there would be nationals who would go to preaching schools in the United States and then come back and evangelize. Sunset School of Preaching, now the Sunset Institute of Biblical Studies, I believe it is. Or no, Sunset International Bible Institute is what its name is now, was one of those where a lot of people from Central America would go, located in Texas, and so they would go be educated for a couple years and then return to their countries. Work in Panama started in the 1940s. Other works in Belize, Costa Rica, Nicaragua developed. Some of these works, these later works that I mentioned, were due to missionaries from the United States. Others were due to local local individuals who became evangelists. Encountered some preaching someplace, and just kind of took it upon themselves to evangelize. Additional activities, in addition to evangelizing and preaching, you have print ministry, radio and TV broadcasts, short-term mission campaigns. A lot of the universities and colleges associated with Churches of Christ have traditionally had a variety of mission campaigns by students. Many of them have focused on South America. Some have focused on Africa, but there's been a lot of attention to South and Central and South America, all in an attempt to try and reach these people that are in these locations. And so that gives us kind of this overview of the expansiveness of Restoration Movement mission work, going to a wide variety of places, some more successful than others, some that were set up through kind of an institutional approach, some that were more independent. But missionary work has been one of those things that has been a distinct marker or a difference, largely due to the institutionalizing of missionary work among the disciples. So that brings us to a conclusion here of the Restoration Movement. Where we go from here now is to kind of think about the contemporary situation of Christianity, as well as what the future holds for mission work. And so in later sessions, we'll start looking at some of those kind of questions.